This is the Web Platform Podcast, the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 62. On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro,
Hello, wonderful people.
Danny Blue,
Hey, everybody.
and myself, Erik Isaksen. And our guest today is Timmy Willison. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am the JQuery Core team lead, and I mostly work on that project. I conduct the meetings and try to define the agenda and keep us going. Was there any more?
All right there.
I can talk about more.
I was just waiting to see how silent things would be. No,
yeah.
Here, let us.
Awkward silences don't bother me. So.
Well, it's great to have you on. So you're at the JQuery Foundation. You're a core member, and now I hear the JQuery Foundation continues to grow, and now you guys are merging with Dojo, which is big news these days from a couple weeks ago. I mean, how does that look these days?
It is really big news, but it's still pretty preliminary. We haven't actually merged yet. It's just an announcement saying that we want to merge, and we're still, or I should say, the board is still working out the details. I'm not actually a member of the JQuery board, so I don't know how the details will get worked out, but I am pretty excited about it. I mean, I've long been a fan of Dojo projects, and I've worked with some Dojo developers, and they're all smarter than me. It's going to be really great to see what we can, do as a merged foundation.
You work at Open Table too now, right?
I do. I'm a senior software engineer.
Awesome. So you work with jQuery on a daily basis, and then you're committing to open source in the evenings, I'm assuming, or something like that.
Yeah, it can get pretty busy at Open Table, so I don't always work on jQuery every day. But I'm a volunteer. I don't get paid. I just do it when I can.
And I mean, I've heard a lot of new people come up to me, and they think that jQuery is JavaScript. It happens in some cases. So can you tell people who are new to web development or new to this type of development, what is jQuery, and what's the history of the organization? How has it changed and all that?
Sure. So jQuery, well, I guess it's a bit of a loaded question. What is jQuery? We might be spending the whole podcast defining jQuery. But
yes, it is very loaded.
Yeah.
It's JavaScript.
Right. But yeah, I guess most of the time when people use the word jQuery, they're talking about the core JavaScript library that you can include in your website and make it easier to write JavaScript cross-browser. It handles, it obfuscates some of the bugs for you, and just makes it easier to work with the DOM.
And when you talk about the bugs, I mean, I think there is this notion, you hear it these days, I don't need to use jQuery now. Browsers have caught up. But jQuery still extrapolates away a lot of those bugs that are still very prevalent on the web today.
It does. No matter, it might surprise people to see how many bugs there still are in modern browsers. Now, there is some truth to that. There are definitely modern web APIs that look a lot like jQuery that you could use, and you might be fine. You might never encounter these bugs that we fix in jQuery. But it's also a little bit about peace of mind, knowing that we are always on the lookout for these bugs and trying to keep them under wraps for you.
How far back does the current version, the latest stable release of jQuery, how far back does it support in IE terms?
So there are now two versions of jQuery. There's the 1.x branch and the 2.x branch. 1.x supports IE8. IE6 and 7 aren't supported anymore. And 2.x supports IE9 and above. Other than that, support is pretty much the same. So we're going to rename jQuery 1.x to jQuery Compat, and before the upcoming version of jQuery Compat 3.0, it didn't support things like Node or Chrome apps or Microsoft apps. But those are minor differences. There's not a lot of usage there compared to, compared to browser usage.
Cool. So the way that Erik was talking about, like just telling if somebody that doesn't know what jQuery was, and I can't imagine anybody that has done much time in web development at all has not at least heard of jQuery. But is there, for kind of just for comparison's sake, is there another library out there that you would compare jQuery to? Maybe if somebody is coming into it brand new, is there something you would compare it to? Like it's not something like an Angular or something, or
right.
or an Ember or React. So is there something else that you would compare it to?
Yeah, I guess you could say the closest thing to jQuery would be Prototype or Dojo. Those are the two I can think of right now. But you're right, it's not like Angular, which is an MVC framework. Angular and jQuery can be used together, and often are. So, yeah.
Cool. No, that's great. So, again, while we're just kind of digging through some of the things of what jQuery is, like you said, try not to spend the entire time just defining what jQuery is, because it does a lot of things. But I'm
okay with doing that. We can do that.
we need to move on to newer stuff.
Yeah.
But so jQuery does a lot of things with DOM manipulation. I mean, you can even see, like the document.query selector, query select, which is, I like the mug, by the way. Nice time.
Oh yeah. There it is.
He has a jQuery mug for everybody that's listening on audio. But so it does a lot with DOM manipulation, specifically making it easier to grab a list of elements and iterate through them. It makes some of that stuff very easy. And I think that's the part that a lot of people use jQuery for. But there's also a set of utilities that are baked in to jQuery.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Ajax method, I know, is a particularly popular one. I know it's one that, still one of the better Ajax libraries that are out there inside of jQuery. And then there's also things that you would think of more of Lodash, like there's a map and a for each method and things like that in there. Right. So the way I just described it, it sounds like it's two separate libraries to me. Are you if you're using Bower or something like that, are you doomed to take this whole giant library in, or or can you like break certain pieces out to say, like, okay, I only want the Ajax method, I only want the helper methods, I don't care about the DOM methods?
Yeah, you can actually, and not a lot of people know about this. You can make custom builds of jQuery and only include the modules that you want. But you do it on the command line. So you clone the GitHub repo and use grunt commands to make a custom build of jQuery.
Very cool.
Yeah.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. I actually did not know that you could do it through the command line.
Yeah. We want to do like a web builder, but that's not out yet.
Are there any plans, and this might be leaking a little bit too far in, are there plans to make the entire library modular, like something the way Lodash is done? So if you install so Lodash is another utility library for those that have not heard of it. If you install it with something like Bower, you get the whole package added in. If you use, and so right now I'm using ES6 on a project in Babel, I can install it with npm, and then I can just import in the certain methods and subsets of the library that I need. Can you do something like that in the current version of jQuery, or are there plans to do that later?
We could probably modularize it more than it is right now, but Lodash is unique in that almost every method can stand alone. It's a utility library, right, and each method can usually be separate from the other ones. Whereas with jQuery, we have, for instance, an effects module. And if you want to use .show, you're actually using some other methods below that, like in CSS. You're using .css under the covers. And we could use like AMD or ES6 modules or something to have everything, or to load methods in, like on a method basis and just its own dependencies. But it gets more difficult when you create methods in a loop that just reuses other methods. So like in the effects module, almost like all the shortcut methods, that's just like 4 lines. So how do you separate that from everything else? It can get a little wonky.
It's definitely a technical design challenge.
Yeah, exactly. But I couldn't be a bigger fan of modularity and Lodash. It's just it's a little bit hard to figure out in jQuery.
No, it makes sense. Like you said, with things like Lodash, it is very the one you can pull in just a certain one method because each method kind of stands on its own. So I can also see how that could be more difficult. But that also kind of brings us into some jQuery 3 stuff. So we talked about 1.x, and we talked about the 2 current versions of it, and then jQuery 3 is the next version that's coming up. So can you speak just to a little bit about what is the a big point, a major point increase usually means something pretty major. So can you talk a little bit about what that is? Like why is this not just an incremental release? Why is it jQuery 3, and is it a separate thing? I forgot what you said. It gets renamed. 1.x gets renamed to now
jQuery Compat. Yeah, taking a cue from Lodash actually.
But will Compat and 2.0 still exist, or is 3.0 its own almost separate thing, or is 3.0 just is it just a continuation of the work that's being done in 2.0?
The latter, yes. It's a continuation, but it's getting a major version bump because there are backwards compatibility. This behavior changes that we want people to be aware of, and so jQuery hasn't always respected semantic versioning. Major versions to jQuery have usually been minor version increases. But we want to switch to semver compatible, and this is the first step. So jQuery 3.0 is it's a designation that means there are behavior changes. Now these behavior changes aren't that drastic. So for instance, jQuery deferreds are going to be promises A+ compatible. This probably won't affect a lot of code, but it will affect some code, so you still need to be aware of the change. The biggest difference is that instead of exceptions being thrown like any other exceptions, they're used as rejection values and passed to rejection handlers. So if you're used to working with native promises or Bluebird or some other, or pretty much any other promises library, jQuery deferreds is going to be it's going to be just like that.
And deferreds were a big deal when jQuery released it. I remember being at the summit way back when deferreds got announced, and it was a big deal then. Like it was this huge sort of shift in the way that you would sort of do things, and it's nice to see it brought up to promises A+ now. Now that it's been there so long. I mean, I think people forget how long jQuery has had deferreds and things like promises.
Yeah. And the writer of that, Julian Auborg, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He's Belgian. Or actually, he's French. But he
did amazing work on it originally. Yeah. I remember how much work he put in on it. Like that was his baby.
Yeah, he did a great job. He also rewrote the Ajax module. And his argument back then was that it's easier to debug errors if they get thrown like any other errors. You know, you can go to the Chrome DevTools and turn on break on uncaught exceptions, right? And see where that error goes to. Now we're getting async stack traces in Chrome DevTools. I don't know if it's enabled yet. It was experimental for a while. And that can make it easier to debug with promises. But that was a big reason for not going promises A+.
So the promise is, I'm assuming, as per the spec, that it doesn't return the jQuery object for these. It does return a promise each time. Right?
Right.
So with that too, for the error handling, if you have logic that's handled like not, it's like handled inside asynchronously inside of your promise callback function, or whatever you want to call it. Like, how does that get handled? Because typically in Angular, at the end you'll throw a .catch, and that'll catch any exceptions handled. But if you just use the standard like reject or fail, it won't catch all of those things. So does jQuery take that into account?
Yes and no. It's still a good idea to attach like catch handlers, like you were saying, because errors can just go into the ether and you'll never see them, and that's the danger of using promises A+ compatible deferreds. But as long as you attach error handlers, you'll see them.
And also, as far as SVG has been a real pain point with jQuery in the past, I noticed you did have some updates on that. So, like, when you add a class in jQuery, that can be very frustrating, where it doesn't actually add it doesn't actually add the class name.
Right.
Because it's SVG and it's not HTML, right? So.
Yeah, it's a little different. You have to work with the attribute in SVG rather than a property called class name, which SVG elements don't have, right?
Exactly.
And I was definitely in favor of adding that, but SVG isn't the DOM, and jQuery is essentially a DOM library. But so many people, want to attach classes to SVG, and it actually improved performance when we supported it, because working with the attribute was just a little bit faster than working with the property. We were surprised by that, because for so long we've said, no, we're not going to fix SVG issues. jQuery is a DOM library, and then we just tried it out and we're like, oh, well, crap, this is actually faster. But we can't do that with everything, right? If you want to create SVG elements, those are created in a fundamentally different way under the covers. It has a different namespace. You can't just call document.create element. You use a different method, method on the web API, right? So you still want to use libraries that are devoted to SVG if you're doing a lot of SVG stuff. But I've had applications where all I really wanted to do was add and remove classes on SVG elements, and jQuery 3.0 will finally do that.
Okay. And there was no other changes to the SVG, like as far as getting more improvements on there, mostly for the reasons that you suggested.
Right. So SVG is still officially on the won't fix list. However, if you make a good enough argument, we'll reconsider each case.
Okay. And animation, too, was another big issue I had. And I used to rely on jQuery's animation when I was starting. I was using prototype jQuery MooTools back in the day. Us old school people like Justin and we've had our share of libraries throughout the years.
I'm not that old. I'm kind of old. Sorry.
Yeah, I might be a little older, but yeah. So yeah, getting to that, like, animations were really painful. But some of the browsers that it supported were, it worked much better than some of the alternatives. And then Flash came along and blew that out of the water. So with the Web Animations API coming up, and what are some of the improvements you've made in animation? Because I saw that you're using Request Animation Frame now.
Yes. So that's been a long time coming. We tried putting that in jQuery 1.6, I think, and we encountered some problems because when you went to another tab and you had animations running on that page, on the page previous, those animations wouldn't actually run because request animation frame, one of its features is that it just shuts off when you're not looking at it to save battery power, right? But when you go back to that page, all those animations have stacked, and then they all get done at warp speed. And people were complaining about that. So we had to back it out.
Good times. Yep.
Yeah.
I remember.
But we've added it back, and we found a fix for that. So we just add a separate timer, like a set timeout, for the time of the animation. And when that callback is called, if the animation hasn't completed or hasn't even run, it's just going to go to the end and throw it away.
How do you deal with synchronized animations, or do you even?
We don't really. I mean, there are ways to deal with that in jQuery, but there are other libraries that probably do that better.
Right. So for some of us too, like jQuery was, I mean, I don't think I would have learned JavaScript as quick as I did without jQuery. It was a really useful tool. It did a lot of good things, and it was very simple. Like the whole way that you return the jQuery object, so you just chain stuff to it, was really, really easy to understand and grasp.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lot of fun to work with. But as the browsers improved and the demands from the users got higher, I started to reach performance caps with jQuery. I had a lot of trouble because of the massive DOM calls, and so I had to figure out how to optimize the jQuery calls and do whatever I could. And eventually, I had to give up and move on to some other technology. So, what is the performance state today of jQuery?
Well, you can definitely uncover some performance bottlenecks if you're working with a lot of DOM. DOM manipulation is still, it might be the slowest thing that we do on the web, which is why React has gotten so popular, making it a virtual DOM to minimize how much we actually manipulate it, or manipulate the real DOM, right? So I would just say use tools to figure out where those bottlenecks are, like webpagetest.org, and optimize it as much as you can. But working with DOM has risks. Working with a lot of DOM, and there's always going to be performance implications with that.
Well, and this goes to an approach, though, too, right? I mean, at some point, if you're doing foolish things with the DOM or any subsystem, really, of you're going to end up with slowness. I mean, performance auditing is, obviously you don't want to pre-optimize, but at some point you do have to do that. And you guys did quite a bit of performance auditing to get to 3.0. I mean, Paul Irish went in and sort of took a look at how visible works and everything else with custom selectors, and that was that there was some great improvements in there in the 3.0 branch, right?
Yeah, totally. What were the details there? So the visible selector was running really slowly because each time it was checking the width and height of an element to determine if it was visible. So if both width and height were 0, then it's invisible. So like if display none was set, width and height will be returned as 0. The problem is, in WebKit at least, retrieving that every time for every element puts a lot of strain on the browser. The browser does a lot of calculations to figure out what the width and height of an element are. And so that selector was just way too slow. But another part of it was parsing the selector every time, because we would try passing. So in Sizzle, under the covers, we try passing the selector to query selector all or matches selector first. We try to use web APIs first. The problem is if there's a custom selector in that selector anywhere, it breaks out of that, and then Sizzle takes over and does it itself. Doing that was very expensive because we were making the browser try to parse the selector every time on each element it was checking. And so we just did a simple change. If this has been tried before, if this selector, if we've tried to give this to match selector or query selector all before, don't do it again and just go straight to Sizzle. And that increased performance a lot.
Yeah, it was like a 20x speed up or some very high number, if I recall.
It was something crazy. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was great. And Paul Irish led us to that, so thank you to him.
So there's published you guys published a code of conduct recently. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, so this has been a long time coming. I was surprised we didn't have one already. But Corey Frang, one of the JQuery board members, brought this up, and he said, "Hey guys, we should have a code of conduct." And he put a lot of work into it. We borrowed much of it from the Django project and the Speak Up, I think. And we finally have a code of conduct. It's just a statement that we want everybody working in the jQuery community to be respectful and considerate to other people, regardless of backgrounds or opinions. We're going to disagree, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together. So.
Excellent.
And you guys have a massive amount of contributors at this point. I mean, I think that sort of goes to the fact that jQuery as a whole has grown. It's just not, Resig's project anymore, where, a lot of people attribute, oh, he's always working on it, but he hasn't worked on it a long time, and it's a huge foundation now with all these moving pieces and all these people, and that's hard to manage. I mean, how are you guys dealing with, the sheer amount of a contribution you guys are getting these days?
Yeah, it's growing and growing, and we only want it to grow more. And it's not just about jQuery projects. There's the Dojo merge, adding Dojo projects, but it's not just about Dojo and jQuery either. It's we want jQuery to be a place that can be a host for all sorts of projects. And right now we have like Esprima, Globalize, and some others that aren't really jQuery related, but are still under the jQuery umbrella, and we provide support and visibility and help however we can. So it's a foundation that I like to think of as a home base for developer advocacy, a place where we can represent developers to standards writers and browser vendors and help. Oh, my power might be going out. What was I saying? Help people contribute in open source.
And that's a great thing too, because it's such a widely known project. You have so many contributors, like you said. It's great that so many people are involved. I think that's awesome. Have you done any analytics on usage? Like, do you guys know who's using jQuery now and how they're using it?
Right. So we don't gather usage statistics ourselves. We mainly look at a site called builtwith.com, and we just look at their statistics and see what they're gathering. They have robots that crawl websites and figure out what's being used there, and it just keeps getting bigger. I think we're on this 72% of the top 1 million websites seems like a massive number, and that number's only gone up.
Well, you've been around for a while too, so
Yeah.
it's been. I mean,
But
it's still
useful.
astronomical.
Yeah, I think people underestimate the usefulness of jQuery these days because we have, everyone likes fancy new hotness things. Ooh, Framework X has now been released and we've got this new stuff. But at the end of the day, sometimes you still have to just get work done. And jQuery is very much a known entity in getting work done,
Right.
which is why I think you see it still continue to grow even in the face of, frameworks that may be more, be the hot topic of the day.
Right. And something I've heard.
It's arguably one of the best APIs, I think, but it's. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think John Resig had a talent for creating APIs, but he also created something that was easily extensible. So the number of plugins is just ridiculous, and it's a two-sided coin, right? It makes it really easy to use, and a lot of people misuse it. But on the other hand, it gets a lot of people developing and writing code that they can understand because it's clean and it's easy to use.
Yeah, and that's something I talked about as far as the registry goes. That's something I talked about in a web components talk that I did recently. So one of the things with UI components in general that I've found is, we have a lot of. I'll tell you, when I look for a jQuery plugin, right, the registry, a lot of times there'll be no description, no tests on some of these things. And so then I'll look for it online off the registry, and I get the same thing. And usually the ones that are paid for, you have to buy. Those are the ones that have documentation. They're the ones that are a little bit more fleshed out. And this is not a problem with jQuery specifically, but this is something that I think as a community we need to solve for UI. Have you guys thought about the registry and what are the steps? What's the it's not as obviously as tight as iTunes. Maybe somewhere along the lines of some other ones out there. Maybe like the Play Store. I don't know. But that type of thing where it's
You're talking about the plugin registry?
Yeah.
Yeah. We've actually stopped supporting that in favor of pushing plugins up to package managers like NPM and Bower.
Right. And there is the same problem too, though. When you go up there,
Sure.
sometimes it's only 001 is the version, and then there's not a lot of information.
Doesn't have any
and
tests
some of them
yet.
are really well documented. You can see the releases, and those are great, but it's not always what you need either. So it's really hard to manage as a community to figure out what's good and what's not. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
Well, it's a cultural shift, right? I mean, it's very easy now for us to push out things that we have built that maybe have been useful in our case, right? You release it out, and it's this thing that's in a package manager, and I can pull it, and it's 001 or whatever. But building communities around open source projects is an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
Just because you push some code, it's a full-time job, right? It's you push some code. Oh, look, everyone will adopt it, and it'll be huge and useful. And I think you see that in most of jQuery. Obviously, you see a lot of that because it is very easy to write plugins. It's very easy to release them out into the wild. And there's just stacks of them, and it has this whole ecosystem of time that has sort of occurred where you just had this constant development of these things. And yes, a lot of them don't have tests because, I would posit 4 years ago, tests were, somewhat of a pipe dream.
Yeah.
For a lot of the things
It's very true.
We all take it for granted now in the web. Oh, look, we have tests, and we have, all these wonderful tools, but back then, not so much, right? Oh, I'm just glad there's a plugin that does this, and I don't have to spend a week writing it.
Remember the days when you had to test every browser manually?
Those were horrible days. Horrible. I don't
Now we
miss
can
them.
automate it all.
Wait a minute. There's days where you don't have to test them manually?
Oh well, I mean, so I joined jQuery in 2011 when John was still working on Core, right? And before releases, instead of running like a whole new test suite on test swarm with all the browsers and everything, because we didn't have browser stack hooked up to it yet, spinning up browsers for us, he would have me go into every browser that we supported and run all the tests. It's like, Timmy, can you run the whole test suite? I was like, okay, here we go. And 2 hours later, I'd be like, okay, it all passed. We can release now.
And you do it because John Resick was there, and he said,
"Oh, I know. If John
this is going to be
something,
the biggest thing ever, and everything will be all right." like Justin said. And it is.
I'm so thankful we have browser stack now.
Yeah, there's some really good tools now, for sure.
We can push a button and run all the tests in all the browsers.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are still manual tests that I think you still need to do, especially in applications. Like you can do integration testing, with WebDriver and stuff, but even that doesn't cover 100% of what you want to cover. I still have like a list of manual tests for every application that I run beyond that.
I think right now one of the biggest challenges in testing for this stuff too is the visuals. So a lot of libraries I've seen, like Huxley is one of them, where it compares. I think Huxley's the one I'm thinking of, but it compares like the styling, right? So it goes through pixel by pixel. It'll create like a screenshot. I think there's a Phantom JS version of this, but it's interesting because then every time you render it, it's going to be slightly different. So that's really hard to like automate. So a lot of it turns into manual testing ultimately anyway. So that may change soon.
Yeah, maybe pixel diffing can help with that.
Well, that's what I mean. Is it may render slightly different each time. So you'd have to be.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So to make sure it's exactly in the right space, and then responsive design brings a whole new world of pain to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like how many screen sizes do you want to test?
Yeah. And for a framework, like jQuery or any framework or library, I should say library like jQuery, it's really important that those tests are out there so people can trust it. When I first started doing TDD with like Jasmine and JavaScript frameworks, I found that a lot of my tests I ended up testing jQuery ultimately, so it was a big learning curve. Like I'd have these giant mocks, and then I'd end up testing the jQuery API and not the code that I really wanted to test. Because you're thinking, it's like a totally different mindset when you're thinking of the DOM.
DOM is hard. I think that's the, at the end of the day, like it between the APIs and the way it behaves and different implementations on different platforms and the tests you have to run, DOM can be very difficult. The jQuery, made the DOM usable to some extent back when the DOM may not have been as easy to use as it is now. Obviously, we have APIs, and the web's come a long way, right? I mean, you look back to what it was and to where we're at now, and things are better. Is it, perfect? Of course not. Obviously, there's things that are still being developed out and will continue being developed out. But yeah, I mean, testing all iterations of all the things has always been hard. I mean, sans web with just other things too. Like it's not, there's no magic bullet for it.
No, there's definitely not. I mean, jQuery too is I think it's still great. It's like, I love using it. It's just for a lot of the applications that I have to build, I have to be scalable and I have to be on mobile. So it's like a lot of enterprise and a lot of, very big client-heavy JavaScript, and I found that jQuery just doesn't help me with that. If I was building like a blog or something smaller, maybe static, some static website or something, I might think jQuery is definitely better than heavy-handing it with a giant hammer like Angular or React. So I mean, it just depends on what you're building. I definitely believe though that jQuery is probably the most widely used JavaScript library out there still.
Yeah, I mean, you want to use the right tool for the job, and jQuery probably isn't the right tool in every situation. But it's not. I mean, I can remove probably from that. But on the other hand, you bring up a point about jQuery's size and loading it on mobile. And there seems to be like a misconception about jQuery in that it's just getting bigger and bigger, and it's too big for mobile. And I would refute that a bit, in that these days the bottleneck to load performance is often not JavaScript, it's images. A lot of times you have an image that's larger than jQuery, just one image. And I think sitepoint.com has statistics on page weight, and images outweigh JavaScript by like 5 times on the average page. And I mean, you can do custom builds with jQuery, you can remove things that you're not using. But even then, I'd say you go to webpagetest.org and see what is actually slowing down the load of your page. You might find that it has nothing to do with jQuery.
And I think that goes to I think that's actually an interesting dilemma too, because as developers, it may be easier for us to complain about library weights or framework weights because we control those things. And you look at the things that, like images or art direction, which sometimes we don't control, which they want 10 images that are stacked up through, megabytes of stuff, and you're begging for just some optimization, and you're not going to get it, and you're trying to eke out every byte you can, and this leads to that misconception, which further goes down the pipe with things like HTTP2, which pipelines a lot of these additional this will give the web a speed boost overall. So you end up with this weird world where we're haggling over bytes that, and a lot of times, why are we talking about raw bytes to begin with? If you're not gzipping this stuff off the server,
right.
then what are you doing exactly?
Step one.
Yeah, step one. Don't do these silly things, and let us stop haggling about that portion of it. But I do understand the sentiment, or sentiment rather. Not to be confused with words.
That said, the jQuery core team still haggles over bytes with every pull request and every commit that we do. We want to make sure we're not increasing the bloat too much. But if I can, list off some numbers, or not real actual numbers, I'm just going to say that jQuery now is smaller than it was in 1.7.2, even the compat version. That's probably due to taking out support for IE6 and 7. And jQuery 3.0 is 3,000 bytes smaller than jQuery compat 3.0 because of IE8 no longer being supported in that branch.
Good riddance.
Yeah. But the point is, it hasn't only increased in size as time has gone on.
Yeah, I remember when in like jQuery 1.8 or 1.9, fully compressed, it was like 19K.
That's true.
So it was the smallest, like prototype was like 90K or something like that. It's like ridiculous. I got into MooTools a lot though too, because MooTools had a lot of things that jQuery didn't have. Like it had like a whole class system, which was totally new to me. Like, because I learned on JavaScript, I never learned classical, so I had to learn classical after. And so it was interesting, like using that very friendly API in MooTools to create these classes that had interfaces, and they implemented things and extended them. And they had some really unique tools. This was before the days of underscore and Lodash too, so there was some really good helper methods in there as well.
Yeah, I didn't use MooTools that much.
But it didn't do as good in the DOM manipulation as jQuery. It wasn't as performant for sure. I miss MooTools.
Yeah. I hear that sometimes.
We had David Walsh on once, and he's one of the contributors to that project, and I was like, wow, that's so fun. I want to do that again.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's got the same problems essentially, though.
Yeah.
So, I mean, some of the stuff we can do prefetching and things. I think, some of the points that Justin you brought up were really key, like with art direction, right? That's a totally different problem, and that's like one of the hardest problems in responsive images. But images too, I think, are a totally separate beast, and I totally agree with you guys that when we're dealing with mobile performance, the bottlenecks are usually the network, the latency, things like that. And when you do these requests, the actual overhead of any request is going to be much greater than the JavaScript speed, because the JavaScript runtime, as you said, is pretty fast.
Yeah.
Right? The load time for jQuery, I don't think, is a problem. I think it's the DOM manipulation at that level is the problems that I've had, and
Sure.
jQuery Mobile takes care of some of that, but it's been very clunky for me. I haven't been able to use it on a project successfully.
Right.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about the differences between the different jQuery projects?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean.
So I jumped around a little bit there, so I'll clarify with that. Sorry. The as far as jQuery Mobile versus jQuery, like jQuery Mobile was meant to be geared towards these devices that you're going to be carrying around and everything, and so it had BlackBerry support at one point. It had all these different. It basically created a nice little wrapper around all the mobile stuff, and it did the same thing as jQuery with some different modifications, as far as I could tell. But it was still really slow, like especially with Android, the animations were slow. Like, what was the reason behind not using jQuery versus using that? Because I've had better luck with jQuery in mobile, actually.
Well, I mean, jQuery Mobile includes jQuery, right? It's just it's on top of jQuery, so it's a user interface system designed to make like responsive websites and apps that are accessible on like all phones, tablets, and desktop, but mainly geared towards phones and tablets. And it was something John wanted to do because mobile was getting more and more popular, and there wasn't really a good way to write user interfaces for all of these devices on the web. And so that was jQuery Mobile's main goal. Like, let's make a platform that let's make a framework that can do those things and perform as well as we can get them to perform on these devices. And that's a very tall order.
Yeah, especially when that was first implemented, because the devices that were available were like pre-Android 4 and early iOS. And man, even today, Safari is not really cutting the mustard on mobile. So it's like, and when you're on iOS, everything is based on Safari's engine, right? It's all WebKit.
Yeah.
So that right there's a lot of challenges in itself, and I think you guys did it. I'm not saying you didn't do a great job. You did a great job on it. It's just like I couldn't get any of it to really work for the performance I needed for the apps that I build. And like I said, right tool for right job before.
Yeah.
I built a fair amount of stuff in jQuery Mobile, particularly for Bada. If anybody remembers Bada, which was not really here in the States, but it was overseas sort of work. And I sort of remember testing on Bada 2 with jQuery Mobile and the nightmare that was sort of the WebKit. Again, I think people underestimate even with some of the, it really depended on the device. I mean, it was such a wide range of devices that had significant support on jQuery Mobile.
Oh, I know. The support list is so long.
It's huge. It's huge, and realistically, like no one likes jank, but I was okay with the fact that my tiny $34 test device of a phone that came from one of the manufacturers that had to run this thing ran it fairly smoothly. I mean, there is such a large expectation these days that everything must be
60
A+
FPS.
support. Yeah, I mean, I think people fail to realize what some of this stuff runs under the hood. You're never going to get like, oh my gosh, I have 5 frames per second right now. I'm having a really good day on this device. Like,
This is the fastest website I've ever seen.
Like it is a very hard thing, and you know, it's easy to get spoiled now. I mean, I readily admit it. You know, you sit here with your my high-powered phone and Retina displayed desktops and things like but that's not necessarily how the rest of everybody has it either. And it's easy to fall into that trap of I'm gonna crank it up to 11 and build this huge monstrosity of a thing, and I'm upset that it doesn't render at 60 FPS on the my low tier. Well, you do have to work towards some middle. Like you do have to have some idea of where you're shipping towards, and I always thought jQuery Mobile did pretty good at that. Like the list of support was, and still is, I should say, really top notch, and I still use it for some things. So Erik, make better 60. Make better jQuery Mobile, Erik. Jeez.
Yeah.
You couldn't pay me enough, like, to support all that stuff, you guys.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I remember the days when they were just trying to find those phones, and like you should have seen the early days when they filled, like those picnic tables with the number of devices that they had. It was funny to see. Like, because they were running tests on all those devices manually, and they still do. They still have all those devices, and they still run tests on them. I don't envy them. I don't have to work on jQuery Mobile, so that's somebody else's job.
And after each device was retired from jQuery Mobile, you took out a hammer and smashed it.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. A lot of the jQuery is still, like I said, one of the best APIs, at least in my opinion, to work with. So for proof of concepts and prototypes, I still use it often, but it's like I stopped using it for heavy scale applications around 1.9. I think that's the last version I use in heavy production.
You started using native JavaScript?
Native JavaScript, Angular. We moved towards Angular. Looked at Ember a little at that point.
Well, Angular actually has a jQuery Lite inside of it.
And that will be removed into. Yay.
Which does a lot of things, but it's largely based on jQuery and does a lot of the same stuff in the same way.
Yeah, some of the more common things you would use jQuery for sure. And when promises first came out, I didn't really understand promises, so I can't really be a good judge on how they were originally. But I'm glad to see that they're now A+ compliant, like you said.
Yeah.
But Ajax is something that was so useful to me because to write out XML HTTP requests cross browser manually was like, forget it.
Yeah.
I didn't have Fetch back then or any of these new APIs.
Yeah, I'm starting to use Fetch. I really like it.
Yeah, it's nice.
But that's probably another point to make about jQuery is that it's influenced the spec so much. Like, where would Fetch be if jQuery Ajax wasn't already a thing? Fetch, the API is a lot like jQuery Ajax. You pass a URL and say .then. It's very similar. And there are lots of APIs that have been influenced by jQuery. So I'm grateful to jQuery in that way. But also to the team members that have talked to spec writers and pushed for it and pushed for these changes in an effort to represent developers and make their jobs easier. And that's something that goes beyond the code. I think it's a larger purpose that any jQuery team member would say. It's more important than just fixing bugs.
Well, and I think that's a very understated thing from most of the jQuery team over the years. I mean, you see a lot of the things that again, people take it for granted. Why do we have query selector all? Well, right. That's
Remember the days when we just had get element by ID and get element by tag name?
Yeah, well, again, and people are like, well, it's because the spec res. Well, it's largely based on the implementations that happened in the community of things that find useful, and jQuery has been at the forefront of that for a long time, where they have continued to define features within Core that people adopt, and then everyone goes, oh, maybe this should be part of the core browsing sort of experience. And you see it a lot now where ideas are fleshed out in sort of shims and polyfills and saying, well, does this kind of work? Like, is this a good API that we would want? Do we want the lower level hook that gets us out of, in the browser that gives us the ability to write higher level code? Like, you see a lot more of that now than you did 4 or 5 years ago, right? And, I don't think the jQuery core team or the foundation get enough credit for that overall, because you guys don't wave your flag around going, look, we came up with that idea like 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think there's some other libraries that are doing that now too. Like,
sure.
I think React has
jQuery.
brought up. I think like React has brought up some really good performance issues with DOMs that may actually influence a lot of how the browsers work. So I mean, React right now is really fast, right? But who knows? Maybe in 5 years' time or something, it won't be as fast as like DOM, or something else will be working underneath DOM.
Right.
It's brought up that conversation just like jQuery did with compatibility and usage.
Yeah. Now go a step further and say the jQuery Foundation is, they just want to continue doing that, and they want to do it at a larger scale with more projects. Because the most important thing is getting people involved and advocating for them as best we can. So, yeah.
All right. So we're getting close to time. Does anybody have any other thoughts or things we'd like to talk about with jQuery?
I mean, I could go on a tangent all day. I'm not sure.
What is jQuery?
Answer that again. Yeah.
All right. Well, we can wrap up then. If people want to find you, Timmy, hunt you down and help code with you,
Sure.
on jQuery or other stuff, or even if people want to just help the jQuery Foundation, where do they need to go?
So for the jQuery Foundation, I'd say go to jQuery.org, and that explains how to get involved. If you want to get in touch with me, github.com/TimmyWill. I'm also on Twitter as Timmy Will, and I think we'll have those links in the show notes.
We definitely will. All right. Well, this has been episode number 60-something. So, 62 jQuery.
62.
62. Wow, we're getting up there. We're getting old, man.
You're getting old.
All right. I'm getting old.
I'm spry.
That's just you.
Yeah.
Speak for yourself.
Oh, no. You guys are getting younger. I'm getting old. All right. I think that's enough banter from me. If there's nothing else, everybody have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.